Washington and the American Revolution. The year 1763 marked the conclusion of a global struggle, the Great War for Empire, which spanned from 1754 to 1763. While the British had emerged victorious against the French, the cost of this triumph was staggering. The conflict had left the British Empire burdened by massive debts, a financial weight that the halls of Westminster were desperate to redistribute. In the American colonies, the victory brought a different kind of anxiety. The victory meant a more direct and regal organization of governance from London, a shift that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the Crown and its distant subjects. The era of relative autonomy was ending, replaced by a rigorous imperial administration designed to extract the funds necessary to maintain a global superpower. By 1764, the policy of the British government shifted from passive oversight to active revenue collection. The Sugar Act was the instrument of this change, designed specifically to curb the rampant smuggling that had long been a staple of colonial commerce. Crucially, the act did not simply raise duties, it aimed to enforce them with unprecedented strictness, cutting down the ability of merchants to evade the tax. This was a fundamental departure from the past. For over a century, the colonists had grown accustomed to a certain level of autonomy in their trade, often operating on the fringes of British law without significant interference. Now, the shadow of the king's authority loomed much closer to the docks of Boston and the plantations of Virginia. To understand the tension, one must look at the economic reality of the colonial elite. In Virginia, men like George Washington were deeply invested in the volatile world of tobacco production. Tobacco was a demanding crop, one that tied the planter to a complex web of social and commercial obligations. These men viewed their London-based merchants as friends, people who looked after their children and supported their social standing in the metropole. However, these relationships were, at their core, purely commercial. As the war debts triggered a contraction of credit across the empire, those same friends in London began to call in debts and refused to extend the credit that the planters had relied upon for generations. This sudden economic squeeze turned personal distress into a political grievance. Americans had complained about duties and about regulation of their trade for 100 years or more, but they submitted to it. The grievance was not merely about the amount of money being taken, but about the authority behind the taking. The Sugar Act and subsequent measures were seen as an active, arbitrary authority. This was particularly galling when Parliament passed the Stamp Act, the first direct tax levied on the colonies by the central government rather than through their own local legislatures. To the colonists, this was an unprecedented invasion of their rights as Englishmen. They were beginning to view their local representative assemblies not just as subordinate bodies, but as the legitimate government of their respective colonies. The struggle was no longer just about money, it was about who held the right to make the law. This economic and political friction acted as a powerful catalyst for an unlikely phenomenon, colonial cooperation. For much of the early 1760s, the 13 colonies functioned as entirely separate entities. A man in New Jersey felt his primary loyalty was to his state, not to a vague concept of an America. However, the persistent pressure from London began to force these disparate groups together. The first significant moment of this unity occurred in 1764 during the Stamp Act Congress. It was an unheard-of event, a gathering of representatives from different colonies to coordinate a response to British policy. The British, in their attempt to consolidate control, were inadvertently driving the colonies into a collective political identity. This cooperation was not born of a sudden surge of patriotism, but of a shared sense of being pushed by an external force. The colonists were not yet revolutionaries, they were British Americans who believed they were being denied the traditional rights of their fellow subjects. They were operating within a republican framework that taught them to be deeply suspicious of arbitrary power and to look for signs of tyranny. When the British closed the port of Boston following the destruction of private property during the Tea Party, it was a moment of extreme distress for the empire, but it also forced the colonies to move from protest to organized resistance. The machinery of revolution was being built through a series of reactive, defensive measures. As the decade progressed, the tension shifted from trade disputes to a fundamental questioning of sovereignty. The contraction of credit and the imposition of taxes created a sense of conspiracy among the colonial leaders. When planters in Virginia discussed their financial struggles with lawyers or militia leaders, they discovered that their neighbors were facing the exact same pressures. This shared experience transformed local economic hardship into a shared political struggle. The question was no longer just about the cost of molasses or tea, but about whether the people, or the community, held the ultimate authority over their own affairs. The foundations of a new political order were being laid in the midst of an imperial crisis. The transition was a slow, drifting process rather than a sudden explosion. Most leaders in 1774 believed their problems could be resolved within the framework of the British Empire, provided their political rights were respected. They were not yet seeking independence, but rather a return to a status quo that allowed them to govern themselves through their local assemblies. It was this very ambiguity that defined the early years of the movement. The revolution was not a single event, but a series of escalating responses to an empire attempting to maintain control over a world that was rapidly outgrowing its old rules. The drifting identity. In the mid-18th century, the concept of an American did not exist. To the inhabitants of the 13 colonies, identity was a matter of local geography and specific loyalty. A man was a Virginian, a New Yorker, or a Connecticut man, and his primary allegiance was to his specific province. They were British Americans, much like a Yorkshireman might consider himself an Englishman, existing within a vast, interconnected imperial framework. While they shared similar governance structures, they functioned as 13 very separate entities, each developing its own organic political life. They were not a unified people, but a collection of disparate communities, bound to the crown by commerce, tradition, and a shared belief in the rights of Englishmen. In 1774, George Washington lived a life of refined, quiet stability on his Virginia estate. He was a man of status, a large and physically imposing figure, known as a superb horseman who took great care in the conduct of his private life. His focus was the cultivation of tobacco, a demanding crop that dictated the social and economic rhythm of his world. To his neighbors, he was a pillar of the status quo, even going so far as to lend money to unruly neighbors simply to maintain the social order of the plantation system. This was the life of a planter, a man who viewed himself as an integral part of the British Atlantic world, far removed from the radicalism that would soon consume the continent. The stability of the planter class relied on a delicate web of credit and commerce. For decades, tobacco growers in Virginia had maintained close, almost familial, relationships with merchants in London, whom they referred to as friends. These merchants provided the credit necessary to sustain the tobacco economy, and in return, the planters supplied the leaf that fueled the empire. However, the massive debts incurred by Britain during the French and Indian War, which raged from 1754 to 1763, triggered a sudden and brutal contraction in imperial credit. Suddenly, those London friends began to call in debts and refused the extensions of credit that the planters had long taken for granted. As the economic pressure mounted, the nature of British policy shifted from mere regulation to what colonists perceived as arbitrary authority. The Sugar Act of 1764 was a pivotal moment. While it actually reduced the duty on molasses, it enforced it with a newfound strictness designed to curb widespread smuggling. This was not merely about the money, but about the principle of sovereignty. The Americans had complained about trade regulations for a century, yet they had largely submitted to them. It was the shift toward direct taxation, such as the Stamp Act, that transformed economic frustration into a fundamental crisis of identity. The tension reached a boiling point in the streets of Boston, far from the quietude of Virginia. The Boston Tea Party was a moment of profound distress for the British, as colonists destroyed private property in a defiant rejection of the East India Company's monopoly. The British response was swift and punitive, closing the port of Boston and demanding full repayment. These actions acted as a catalyst, driving the disparate colonies toward an unprecedented cooperation. The Stamp Act Congress of 1764 had been the first tremor of this unity, but the escalating hostilities in Massachusetts were forcing a much more permanent and dangerous alliance. By 1775, the conflict had moved from political debate to open skirmishes. In the winter of 1774 and 1775, local committees in Massachusetts began collecting arms to resist British authority by force. The situation drifted toward violence when General Gage, the British governor, sent troops to seize an armament store in Concord. The resulting clash at Lexington Green was a small, almost trivial event in the grander scale of the war, yet it was the spark that ignited a global conflagration. The British pushed through to Concord but were met with fierce resistance, forcing a retreat back to Boston and leaving them effectively bottled up within the city. The fighting moved to the hills of Bunker Hill in June 1775, where the British achieved what many considered a Pyrrhic victory. While they eventually captured the heights, the cost in human lives was staggering and disproportionate to the tactical gain. The battle demonstrated that the colonial militias, though largely local farmers, were capable of inflicting heavy casualties on professional British regulars. This victory, such as it was, did not end the conflict, but it fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the Revolution, proving that the struggle would be long, bloody, and deeply transformative. As the war progressed, the definition of the enemy began to shift from a specific grievance against Parliament to a rejection of the king himself. This shift was accelerated by the radicalism of Thomas Paine, whose publication of Common Sense in January 1776 acted as powerful political propaganda. Paine's writing was described as a sparkling piece of literature that dismantled the argument for allegiance to the crown. He argued that the colonists owed no allegiance to a royal brute. This intellectual shift was crucial. If the colonists no longer owed allegiance to the king, they were no longer merely protesting British policy, but were instead becoming an independent nation. The Revolution was not a unified movement of a single people, but a complex, often fractured, civil struggle. In the South, the war functioned as a brutal civil war between backcountry farmers and the established tidewater planters. These local grievances were often more about land and local authority than the high philosophy of the Declaration of Independence. Furthermore, the war was complicated by the question of slavery, which introduced a terrifying dimension to the conflict. As the number of enslaved African Americans in Virginia grew to over 40% by the eve of the Revolution, the social order was inherently unstable. The struggle for liberty was deeply paradoxical, as it was often fought for one group while denying it to others. In 1775, Lord Dunmore's proclamation promised freedom to any slaves who fought for the British, a move that sent waves of terror through the planter class. This reality meant that many black Americans found their path to liberty through the British, rather than the Americans. Approximately 20,000 black Americans fought for the British, and many departed with them at the war's end. The Revolution was, in many ways, a war of conflicting liberties, a struggle for independence for white men, and a struggle for emancipation for those held in bondage. Ultimately, the Revolution was a drifting process that shifted the very locus of sovereignty. The traditional hierarchy, where the crown was the ultimate authority, was replaced by a new, more radical concept, the sovereignty of the people. While the people in the 18th century referred to the community or the colony as a whole, rather than a universal electorate, the idea had an immense, unfolding potential. This shift created a possibility for future political expansion, even as the men who led the revolution often held deeply conservative, even aristocratic, views of governance. The revolution was not a completed act of democracy, but the beginning of a long, ongoing process of becoming democratic. The language of liberty. By 1776, the 13 colonies were no longer merely disgruntled subjects of the British Crown. They were a collection of disparate entities, each with its own organic governance, beginning to coalesce into something new. People in the colonies did not yet see themselves as Americans. A soldier from New Jersey might stubbornly insist his only country was New Jersey. Yet, beneath this surface of localism, a profound intellectual shift was underway. The revolution was not a sudden explosion but a drifting process, a slow movement where the locus of sovereignty began to shift from the distant king to the concept of the people. This shift required a new vocabulary, a way to justify the breaking of a sacred contract with a legitimate ruler. The intellectual architecture of this new world was built upon a tension between two great European traditions. On one side stood the English Enlightenment, heavily influenced by John Locke, which focused on the protection of individual property and the legalistic rights of the subject. On the other side was the Scottish Enlightenment, which viewed man not just as an owner of things, but as a moral being within a community. This debate is etched into the very words of the Declaration of Independence. While many see a purely Lockean document, others argue that the phrase pursuit of happiness reflects that Scottish emphasis on the moral development and well-being of the citizen, rather than the mere safeguarding of assets. This distinction becomes particularly striking when one considers the alternative phrasing that might have been used. Had the founders been purely focused on the Lockean tradition, the document might have spoken of the protection of property. However, the phrase pursuit of happiness was chosen, a term that carried a much more expansive, almost social, resonance. Some historians suggest this was a deliberate choice to avoid the complications of slavery, as many of the men drafting the document were themselves slaveholders and would have found the term property difficult to reconcile with the concept of unalienable rights. It was a linguistic pivot that allowed for a broader, more idealistic vision of human existence. If the Declaration provided the high-minded philosophy, Thomas Paine provided the radical fuel. In January 1776, Paine published Common Sense, a work that transformed the character of the rebellion. It was not merely a political pamphlet, it was a sparkling piece of literature, acting as potent political propaganda that reached the masses. Before Paine, many colonists were still trying to reconcile their grievances within the framework of the British Empire, arguing for their rights as Englishmen. Paine shattered that connection. He argued that the colonies owed no allegiance to a royal brute and that the very idea of monarchy was an absurdity. His words turned a legal dispute into a revolution of the mind. The task of codifying this new reality fell to a committee of giants: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Roger Sherman. Though they were a group of diverse interests, they were united by a legalistic necessity. They needed to prove to the world, and to the colonists themselves, that their rebellion was justifiable. They were highly legalistic, focusing on a long list of grievances against King George III to prove he had broken the social contract. They were not just declaring independence, they were presenting a legal case for the dissolution of a political union, arguing that when a ruler becomes a tyrant, the governed have a right to revolt. Interestingly, the preamble we celebrate today, the part claiming all men are created equal, was not the primary focus for the men in 1776. To the Continental Congress, the most important part was the list of specific actions by the king that justified their break from Britain. The idealistic language of the preamble was, in many ways, boilerplate, a way of stating the principles of the Enlightenment. It was not until much later, particularly during the abolitionist movement, that this preamble was elevated into the Central American credo that we recognize today. At the time, it was a secondary philosophical framework for a very practical, very legalistic act of secession. This tension between the legalistic and the idealistic reflects the broader struggle of the era. While the leaders were debating the nuances of republican virtue and the duties of a citizen, the reality on the ground was often far more visceral. The revolution was not a singular, unified struggle for liberty, it was a series of local grievances, land disputes, and internal conflicts. In the South, the war became a brutal civil war, pitting backcountry farmers against tidewater planters in a struggle that often had more to do with local control than with the distant king. The language of liberty was being used by many, but it meant very different things depending on who was speaking. The most profound contradiction lay in the very concept of liberty being fought for. As the war progressed, the role of slavery became impossible to ignore. In Virginia, the number of enslaved African Americans had risen from 10% in 1700 to over 40% by the eve of the Revolution. The British attempted to exploit this tension, with Lord Dunmore promising freedom to slaves of rebellious masters in 1775. This sent ripples of terror through the planter class, who feared internal rebellions. Ultimately, more black Americans fought for the British than for the Americans, with roughly 20,000 departing with the British at the war's end, marching under banners that proclaimed liberty. Ultimately, the Revolution was a democratizing force, not because it achieved immediate equality, but because it created the possibility for it. It moved the conversation from the rights of Englishmen to the sovereignty of the people. Even if the people in the 18th century meant only a limited group of men, the term itself was a powerful, expanding concept. It set in motion a process of political evolution, an unfolding of rights that would eventually demand the inclusion of those who were excluded at the founding. The language of liberty provided the tools that future generations would use to demand the very equality the founders had only tentatively embraced. In 1774, George Washington was not a revolutionary leader, but a man of refined manners and a quiet, stable lifestyle. As a tobacco and wheat farmer in Virginia, he was deeply invested in the established order, even going so far as to write a book on how to behave properly in polite society. He was a man of the status quo, a wealthy planter who often lent money to neighbors simply to maintain the social stability of the plantation system he inhabited. Yet, beneath this veneer of colonial gentility, the economic foundations of his world were fracturing. The collapse of the tobacco market in the 1760s and early 1770s, combined with a serious contraction of credit across the British Empire, began to squeeze the very lifeblood of the Virginia aristocracy. The merchants in London, whom Washington and his peers had long considered friends, began to call in debts and refuse the extended credit that had once sustained the colonial economy. This economic squeeze was not an isolated misfortune but a catalyst for political paranoia. As men like Washington found themselves in distress, they began to talk in the House of Burgesses and at militia gatherings. They realized that the hardships they faced were being felt by all their neighbors, leading to fears of a grand conspiracy by British authorities to deprive them of their liberties. They were already reacting to the Stamp Act of 1765, the first direct tax from Parliament that bypassed local legislatures. While earlier taxes like the Sugar Act of 1764 primarily aimed to curb smuggling by enforcing duties more strictly, the Stamp Act was seen as a direct invasion of rights. For the colonial elite, the issue was not merely the monetary cost of the taxes, but the arbitrary nature of the power they represented. As the conflict intensified, the social fabric of the colonies began to tear, revealing deep-seated contradictions within the colonial project. In Virginia, the demographic reality was shifting toward a volatile imbalance. The enslaved African American population had risen from 10% in 1700 to more than 40% by the eve of the Revolution. This demographic shift created a profound sense of terror among the planter class, who feared internal rebellions by the people they held in bondage. This fear was exacerbated when the British government refused to suspend the importation of new slaves, a move the Virginians had sought to prevent to stabilize their own local markets. The Revolution, framed by many as a struggle for liberty, was being built upon a foundation of systemic enslavement that threatened the very security of the men leading the revolt. The tension reached a breaking point in 1775 when Lord Dunmore, the British governor, issued a proclamation that sent ripples of terror through the southern colonies. He promised freedom to any slave whose master joined the rebellion. This was a direct weaponization of the existing social anxieties in the South, turning the struggle for independence into a fight for survival for the slaveholding class. It highlighted the profound irony of the era. As white colonists fought for their own liberty against the Crown, the British were offering liberty to those held in bondage by those very same colonists. The war was not just a political separation, but a radical upheaval that threatened to upend the entire social and racial hierarchy of the American continent. While the conflict is often viewed as a unified struggle, in many regions it was a brutal, localized civil war. In the South, particularly in the Carolinas, the fighting was not between Americans and the British, but between neighbors. It was a violent clash between backcountry farmers, who often felt oppressed by the local landed elite, and the tidewater planters who sought to maintain their traditional authority. These skirmishes were characterized by extraordinary atrocities, as militias and loyalist troops fought over land, local grievances, and political allegiances. For many, the war was less about the distant politics of London or Philadelphia and more about settling long-standing local disputes and seizing land in the West. In this chaos, thousands of Black Americans found themselves caught in the crossfire, often choosing the side of the British in search of actual emancipation. Approximately 20,000 Black Americans fought for the British, forming regiments that marched under banners proclaiming liberty. They saw the king as a more viable path to freedom than the men who claimed to fight for liberty while keeping them in chains. When the British finally departed the United States at the end of the war, these thousands of men and women left with them, seeking a future in a land where their status was no longer defined by their former masters. Amidst this fragmentation, the Continental Army required a leader who could hold a disparate collection of colonies together. George Washington was chosen not because he was a brilliant military strategist, but because he represented the immense wealth and influence of Virginia. His presence ensured that the wealthiest and most powerful state was tied to the cause of independence. Washington was a physically imposing man, described as having a great sense of gravitas and being a superb horseman. His military record was one of survival rather than decisive victory. He focused on keeping his army intact through strategic retreats, knowing that as long as the army existed, the revolution lived. Washington's leadership was defined by an intense, almost obsessive level of control. He was a notorious micromanager, a man who managed the complex relationship between the military and civil authorities through a staggering volume of writing. His wartime correspondence spans 25 volumes, reflecting a leader who was constantly responding to complaints, managing supplies, and defending his reputation against political rivals. He was not a man of speculative intellectualism like Jefferson, but a man of action and duty who viewed his service as a civic obligation. It was this relentless management and his ability to hold the army together through the darkest years that eventually made him the only possible candidate to lead a new nation.
Thomas Paine later called him treacherous in private friendship, a hypocrite in public life. The world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor.
The revolution was a process of becoming, a slow drift from being British subjects to becoming Americans. It was not a sudden explosion of democratic ideals, but a complicated, often messy transition from a monarchical hierarchy to a system of representative government. The concept of the people was initially limited to the community or the colonial assembly, rather than a universal electorate. As the war progressed, the focus shifted from the rights of Englishmen to the sovereignty of the people, creating a framework that would eventually allow for much greater inclusion. This tension between the aristocratic leadership of men like Washington and the radical impulses of the era would define the new American identity for centuries to come. The sovereignty of the people. The history of the American Revolution is often taught as a sudden, explosive rupture, a singular moment where 13 colonies awoke and decided to defy the British crown. Yet, the reality was far more fluid. It was a drifting process, a slow and often accidental movement that spanned years. In the early years of the 1770s, most colonists did not see themselves as Americans, but as British Americans, holding a fierce loyalty to the king and the protections of the English Constitution. They were not seeking to build a new nation, but to preserve their rights as Englishmen. This was not a unified uprising of a single people, but a collection of separate entities, each with its own local identity and governance, drifting together only when the pressure of imperial policy became too great to ignore. The true turning point was not a battle, but a vote. While the world remembers the 4th of July, the decisive moment of political separation occurred on the 2nd of July. On that day, the Continental Congress passed the Resolution for Independence, a move that was far from certain. The debate was so contentious that the Pennsylvania delegation only cast their votes after two cautious patriots, John Dickinson and Robert Morris, stood at the door to allow their colleagues to pass. This was a legalistic, carefully measured act. The delegates were not merely shouting for liberty, they were attempting to justify a revolution against a legitimate ruler by meticulously documenting the king's failures to uphold his contract with the colonies. The drafting of the Declaration of Independence was a task of heavy political theater. A committee was formed, including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Roger Sherman. Jefferson, the junior member from Virginia, was tasked with the writing. Interestingly, the preamble, the famous words regarding equality and unalienable rights, was not the primary focus for the men of 1776. To them, the most vital part of the document was the list of grievances against King George III. They needed to prove that the king had broken the social contract, thereby providing the legal and moral justification for rebellion. They were, in many ways, still thinking within a deeply English, Lockean framework of rights and contracts.
We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
This famous preamble has become an American credo, but its intellectual origins are a subject of intense scholarly debate. Some historians suggest the language reflects the Scottish Enlightenment, specifically the idea of man as a moral being capable of pursuing happiness, rather than the English Enlightenment focus on the protection of property. Others argue the phrase pursuit of happiness was a tactical choice, a way to avoid the word property, which would have been complicated by the institution of slavery. Regardless of its exact source, the document captured a profound shift in the locus of sovereignty. Power was no longer something that flowed down from the crown to the colonies, it was something that resided in the people. This shift in sovereignty fundamentally redefined the people. In the 18th century, the term did not imply a universal electorate of every man, woman, or person of color. Instead, it referred to the community or the colony as a whole, the collective body of citizens. The revolutionary leaders were often men of the better sort, aristocratic planters and wealthy merchants, who believed that the most virtuous men should govern. They feared mob rule and were deeply suspicious of pure democracy. For them, the goal was a republic where the people held the ultimate authority, but that authority was exercised through stable, representative institutions designed to check the passions of the many. This tension between the radical impulse of equality and the conservative desire for order defined the early American Republic. Even George Washington, a man of immense gravitas and immense wealth, embodied this paradox. He was a man who had served the British Empire with distinction, yet he became the indispensable leader of its rebellion. Washington was not a political theorist like Jefferson, nor a radical provocateur like Thomas Paine, who famously argued in Common Sense that the colonies owed no allegiance to a royal brute. Instead, Washington represented a form of republican virtue, the idea of the citizen soldier who, despite having much to lose, would serve the common good. While the leaders spoke of liberty, the war itself was often a brutal, localized civil war. In the South, the conflict was not just between British and Americans, but between neighbors, backcountry farmers fighting against tidewater planters. This was a war of intense factionalism and local grievances, where armies would pass through a region, and the local population would change sides based on who was currently occupying their land or offering the best terms. It was a chaotic, fragmented struggle that often felt disconnected from the grand ideals being debated in Philadelphia. The most profound contradiction of this revolution for liberty was the role of slavery. As the war progressed, the definition of the people was challenged by those the revolutionaries claimed to represent. In Virginia, the number of enslaved African Americans had risen from 10% in 1700 to over 40% by the eve of the Revolution. When Lord Dunmore, the British governor, promised freedom to any slaves who fought against their rebellious masters, it sent a wave of terror through the planter class. Ultimately, many black Americans saw the British as the true agents of liberation, with approximately 20,000 of them fighting for the crown and departing with the British at the war's end. The Revolution's legacy is not that it achieved a perfect democracy, but that it acted as a massive democratizing force. It did not grant equality to all, but it created the political language and the institutional structures that made future expansions of rights possible. By shifting the source of power to the people, the revolution opened a door that could never be fully closed. It set in motion a long, unfolding process of inclusion, a struggle to expand the definition of who the people actually were, a process that would continue through the abolition of slavery and the expansion of the franchise for centuries to come.